Hello again. I'm Madhu Reddy. Greetings from Anekdhara. On behalf of Anekdhara, which is a public policy portal, I welcome all of you, those of you who have tuned in to this sixth webinar hosted by us. The theme for today's webinar is National Education Policy and its implications. We are all aware that across the world, as in India, over the last 4 decades, a major change has gradually crept in. This change has crept in because of an idea that educational institutions can be run on the principles of the market. An idea which has kind of treated teachers as service providers and outsourcing as efficiency, and has given space to NGOs as stand-ins for the state. An idea which treats what a student should learn or what is the value of education based on the future earnings that the student would get based on his learning. So these developments raise certain questions about what is the purpose of education, what should be the relationship between the state and the school, and what we as citizens and stakeholders, what is our take on what the kind of education system we need. On this last question about the citizen involvement in the education policy and the education system of their choice, I would like to refer to a prescient warning by Martin Luther King Jr. He said, while writing in his essay on the purpose of education, he warned, I quote, "If we are not careful, our colleges will produce a group of close-minded, unscientific, illogical propagandists consumed with moral acts. Be careful, brethren. Be careful, teachers," unquote. So this is a kind of a warning where the education system has to be guarded to ensure that it remains a kind of a conception which is not narrow, which that narrow conception which has gained acceptability over the last few decades. Now, as far as the public policy in India is concerned, there have been 2 milestone developments in the last 12 years or so. The first is the Right to Education Act of 2009, and the second is the National Education Policy of 2020. The first, the Right to Education Act, declared that it is the duty of the state to provide education for all children, and it laid down a rights-based framework for ensuring and achieving universal elementary education. Next up, close on the heels of the outburst of the pandemic, we had the pandemic which kind of ravaged human life, including education. The National Education Policy was announced. This policy basically aims at 2 things: equity and access to quality education. As the policy document says, the policy is aimed at, quote, at producing engaged, productive, and contributing citizens for building an equitable and inclusive and plural society as envisaged by our constitution. So that is the avowed intent of the new National Education Policy 2020. So now we have certain issues which may come up. Does this policy put an end to the apprehensions of the citizens, the stakeholders, and the teachers? Is it based on a clear understanding of the ground realities of inequity in the Indian society? Does it help strengthen and foster reason, critical thinking, and creativity? Does it strengthen the rights-based framework on universal elementary education? And in the realm of higher education, with all the self-financing courses and high tuition costs, will they be regulated to improve access and quality? Is there evidence of increased allocation of resources for education? Is the policy intent matched by action, or are there infirmities in putting the policy into practice? Questions such as these and more will be addressed by our speakers today. We have with us two speakers of repute, two reputed academics and educationists. I do not know whether they'll give a perspective from the left or the right, but I'm sure with the passion and the commitment they bring to the table, they'll give their perspectives on education from their hearts. So let us make the most of it, friends, with their presence here. As they speak, you may post your questions onto the YouTube chat box. We will take up these questions in the question and answer session after the two speakers complete their address. So that's about today's theme. I now have the privilege of introducing our first speaker, Professor Anita Rampal. Professor Anita Rampal is currently the Director, Institute for Transformative Education and Research, Delhi. She was the Dean, Faculty of Education, Delhi University. She was a Nehru Fellow and the Director, National Literacy Resource Center at the National Academy of Administration. She has been associated with the National Curriculum Framework of 2005. She was the chairperson of the NCERT Primary Textbook Development Teams, and she also chaired the committee for the 2-year BED. As a member, she was a member of several committees of policy. She has been actively involved with the People's Science Movement, the Right to Education Act, and other educational initiatives. Her areas of work are policy studies, curriculum studies, education for sustainable development, critical mathematics education, science, technology, society studies, and teacher education. So we have a person with credentials which are second to none. And we are indeed fortunate that she's here with us. Professor Rampal will speak to us on engaging with education policies between and beyond the lines. I will now request Professor Anita Rampal to address this webinar. Please come in, ma'am.
Sorry. Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be with all of you. And as you have stated what are the kinds of questions that we'll be looking at, I'll start off immediately by what we see in the new policy, because I have been involved with teaching policy, making policy wherever possible, and also reading policy. So that's why I spoke about reading between the lines and beyond the lines. There are just 2 lines in this policy right at the beginning which talk of a vision. Normally our policies, right from even before 1948, always go back and they locate what the situation is, what have been the challenges, and what are the new challenges for education. But this policy starts with saying that it wants to develop an education system rooted in the Indian ethos that contributes directly to transforming India, that is Bharat, suitably into and sustainably into a vibrant knowledge society, and thereby making India a global knowledge superpower. And it ends by saying, with truly global citizens. So this itself is, is something which raises questions. What is it that we understand by a global citizen or a truly global superpower? But I just want to say that when we read the statement from our Education Commission report just after independence, and we know that this came at the time of a devastating partition. So what was it that, and in fact, this is not true of only one education commission, this was the Radhakrishnan Education Commission, but every policy or education commission has looked at education as the Constitution did. In fact, when the Constitution was being made, and adult franchise, suffrage, a vote for everyone was negotiated as something that was not going to be adulterated, as Gandhi said, and as Ambedkar said, that we cannot now make it conditional on the fact whether people are educated or not, because we know for centuries a large majority has been deprived of education. So we can't place that injustice as a condition for the vote. So what was important for Ambedkar was, and he had studied under whom someone we look at as an educational thinker, but a political scientist at Columbia University called John Dewey. And one thing that Ambedkar carried with him back was this idea of associated living. You know, can education lead to that? Is democracy tied to associated living? Because Ambedkar said we can try fraternity. I mean, we can try equality, we can try other things, but where will fraternity come from in a country which is so divided and so tightly regimented in terms of caste and religion? So for them, education, and they actually promised within 10 years, free and compulsory education as a directive principle, which took 60 years. And even then, after the Right to Education Act, we are probably going in an opposite direction right now. So I'm reminding ourselves that education is tied to democracy. And the first Education Commission says it so clearly. It says that, you know, democracy needs freedom of the mind. In fact, it says the morality of the mind. And it says that even professional integrity of teachers would require that they should be as free to speak on controversial issues as any other citizen of a free country. And of course, they go on to say that, you know, we must cultivate the art of human relationships. They said, we know that the democratic freedom cannot be had without social justice, but that is not enough. We have to cultivate the art of human relationships, the ability to live and work together, overcoming the dividing forces of the time. And this was 48, 49. What do we see now? We see now that there can be, just some time back, that a student, a graduate from a top engineering institute, can actually mercilessly beat a 14-year-old who has not got the right to education. He's not been to school, and he just walks into a place of worship and he says, I cannot read whether, you know, you have said that I'm forbidden to go in to drink water. He walks in to drink water from a tap and is beaten mercilessly, more so for the video that is being made. So he tells the person who's taking a video, dono chehre badhiya se dikhne chahiye. Both of us should be shown in the video. And then he beats him. He beats him on his private parts, and he really bashes him. And the father says, no religion teaches us to beat someone just if a person wants to drink water. So we have seen what has happened. So our question is, what was the kind of education that this top engineering institute gave or did not give that young graduate? And what is it, why is it that this 14-year-old child, Habib, did not get the kind of education which is a fundamental right to him? And what is it our policy that is saying today? In fact, our policy, what is worrying is that whenever it talks of constitutional values, and this is invariably true, it prefaces them with what it calls ethical or even basic human values. So with that, what happens is that there is, at one place, there is a list of 26 terms which can be called values, but they begin with things like seva, ahimsa, swachhata, and it even sort of prefaces things like respect for public property, or, you know, courtesy, sacrifice, spirit of service, etc. And right at the end of these lists of 25 terms would come the 4 terms which we want to talk about, the Constitution. So right at the end, so you know what is happening. It's marginalizing every time it speaks of Constitution values. And in fact, when it speaks of rights, it always tries to bring duties before that. Responsibility in the list of values comes much before equality or justice. or fraternity. Not just this, what is happening is that the Right to Education Act, which came in 2009 from a big movement. There was, in fact, a big movement from the ground which said that on the one hand, the country is saying we have Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, which is nowhere near an Abhiyan, unlike the Saksharta Abhiyan, which we know because many of us did participate in that. And many of you may have also known what was happening in districts, and it was a decentralized program. In our country, for the first time in the history of education, it was a decentralized district-based program where even the teaching materials and the planning was done in a decentralized manner. I'm underscoring this because the policy is talking of centralizing everything. So much so that it's even talking of a national core essential content, which will be centralized and which the NCRT will then be held responsible for. And we know already the way the states are being given diktats. I mean, they have 170 pages of guidelines that are being given to states, even while they're making their state curriculum framework. So you know what is happening in the term of centralizing. And we also know that 2 days back, the CBSE is a central board for secondary education. We know that under the name of COVID and under the name of classes and schools being abandoned and closed, it had cut down many, many parts of the curriculum and very choice. I mean, the selection was very clear. It cut down people's movements, it cut down democracy, it cut down environmental degradation. So all these things had been cut, but 2 days back, it has cut the chapters on democracy and diversity and discrimination in the political science and the social science textbooks. In fact, last year, in 2020, just after the policy, on Independence Day, when I wrote about the policy, I had ended by saying, in this national essential component content, I wonder whether Fairs' poems will remain and will be able to survive. And this is exactly what has happened. We just now hear that globalization impact on agriculture is out, and more importantly, democracy and diversity and discrimination is out. So we know that under the name of centralization, federalism, because education is is a concurrent subject, and states have to be making their own curricula. And that's why I reminded ourselves that in the 90s, the National Literacy Program, in fact, did not go by what the state resource centers were saying, but districts decided, made their own curricula depending on what they thought were the immediate experiences and issues that were important for adults in that context. And all our education theories tell us that learning is, one, a social process. It means it doesn't happen alone. There's not an individual learner who can stare at a board or who can stare at a screen or a textbook and learn. That is not how learning happens. It happens when people engage, when either students engage with each other, and then even when they engage with an adult. So it's a social process. And secondly, it is culturally rooted. So what I experience around me, that is how I construct my knowledge, because learning is not transmission of information, it is construction of knowledge. Whether it's a small child or it's an adult, it's a student at the university, it's knowledge construction. So it's a social constructivist theories of learning that we work in, that we teach, and that is how the National Curriculum Framework and the textbooks had been developed. But today, under the banner, under the pretext of a COVID, not only was the policy pushed in without the parliament having a debate, without a discussion, but the chapter which was introduced from the 2019 draft, what came in 2020, was a major thrust for online education. And in fact, it said that the natural path for higher education would be online education. So it had actually stated that, and in a big way, even today, it's pushing for online education. We know that this has been devastating. We have done surveys in many states, and we know that there were lakhs of children who were absolutely abandoned. I don't believe, just like I'll make it clear why I don't believe in the term learning outcomes, because that's a discourse of denial, because our policy says we will not focus on inputs, we will focus only on outcomes. We know what that means. And it says that the right to education is too restrictive. So we'll be loosening this. So, what do all these terms signify to some of us who have been battling and struggling and working for for first the right to education to come in, and then the right to education to be implemented in spirit as a fundamental right, which is a historic right. People working across the world in the rights framework say that even the way this 18-page document is written, it's a historic right because it's a transformative right. Just like our constitution, our lawyers and our scholars of constitution tell us that our constitution is a transformative pedagogic project. By that they mean that it accepts that there are inequities, it accepts that there is no social justice, especially when it was written, but it shows the way. It actually has a commitment and for that transformation, and it shows us that education with equity in education can actually lead to equity in society and can actually meaningfully also nurture democracy. So I'm trying to say that this is what the constitution is meant, and this is what our right to education says. Even for children 6 to 14, it says that an education with exploration and discoveries, and every child to be given the freedom to express diverse opinions, again something which our university students today are not able to do, and they are either imprisoned or charged with all kinds of serious charges and cases on them, just because they may be fighting for the rights of others around them, or they're fighting for against commercialization, or they're fighting for a good public education institution not going the way of privatization. And so I'm saying this because even a right to education actually allows and it tells us that a young child should get education like that. So what is it that is, so on the one hand, as I said, consolidation is something the policy talks of in terms of efficiency, as was just pointed out. It even says that schools will be made into complex clusters of schools. Teachers will be appointed at the cluster, not at a school. So before the policy came in, the Niti Aayog had been, in 4 states, had been merging and closing schools, thousands of schools. And as soon as the policy came in, most of the states that closed thousands, I mean, there were tens of 15 thousands of schools in tribal areas. So we know what happens because those are remote habitations. And the policy says it's not optimal to be having schools with low enrollment. So it's taken away the basic fundamental right, which says a neighborhood school for every child and a good quality school with trained teachers. So when it talks of saying that this is too restrictive, it also talks of saying alternative models. And one of those alternative models is that children can study through the open school. The right to education, when it came, had actually said there was a demand that open schooling, which means you sit at home and materials reach you, should not be allowed till class 8, because that a child has a right to a neighborhood school. But now this policy says you can have open schooling even at grade 3, because open school runs exams at grade 3, at grade 5, and grade 8. And this policy is endorsing that. In fact, it's calling many private players under this scheme and saying that, you can come in and we are not going to focus on outcomes. Another danger of the open school is that it becomes a way to circumvent not just the basic criteria of what should be a school and what should be the qualifications of a teacher and who should be a teacher, what kind of pupil-teacher ratio, all these qualifications which go with a board. Open school does not insist on anything like that. Obviously, it assumes that you don't even need to have a school, but people are running these schools. So there's a huge business of low-cost private schools. In the world outside, it's called as the multi-billion-dollar industry of low-cost private schools in countries of the global south. In India, there's a big industry which is being envisaged and nurtured by a lot of corporate non-state actors. I prefer to call them, because they're now called NGOs, but they're not really the NGOs that we have known and worked with. And these are huge corporate NGOs, and they have in fact been fighting against the RT. They've been opposing the RT even on false claims at times. I mean, there is Central Square Foundation, there is Pratham, there is Teach for India. These organizations have tied up and have a huge network. And they, in fact, even when they work for public education, the public system outsources people from outside. So the training can be on a private app. Delhi government is a good model of that. It is completely neoliberal in what it does. Our best students from Delhi University teach in Delhi government schools, and they're quite horrified. In class 3, children are segregated, physically segregated. A test is taken, some division of 2-digit numbers. You can't do it, sorry, too bad. You're a slow learner. You're put into a different section. You get a dumbed down curriculum. So you're not taught from the books. That's the other curriculum. The students who are called Pratibha in class 6, there are these students are called Nishtha, so very fancy names, but the child who's called Nishtha knows that she's not talented. So you segregate children. There's a court case going on in the High Court against this, because there's another discrimination happening under the name of ability, under the name of learning outcomes. And you segregate them, you give them a dumbed down curriculum. We know that. My students have done dissertations within the system, and an exam is different. So the exam for the so-called talented is different from the exam from the Nishtha students. You can call them new readers, slow learners, whatever name you like. And by class 9, thousands of children are pushed into the open school. Why? Because open school results do not taint the board results of CBSE. So when a state government like Delhi wants to showcase its results through hundreds of front page advertisements, it has quietly pushed the so-called slow learners into open school. And I have personally seen, because around Delhi University, there were students who were not allowed. They were told to do it by open school. When they passed class 10, they came back to their school. We were familiar with these schools. All our students did internships. I went with some of these students to get them admission, because the principal said, sorry, you passed from the open school, but now the principal gives me a card and says, madam, don't waste your time, send them into vocational training. So that is the idea. You separate them fast enough and you create another hierarchy of skill versus knowledge. So when we say we are creating a knowledge society, we have already pushed out large numbers, and these are large numbers. And the only people following this up are some very diligent journalists in Delhi who actually file a right to information, a petition to get data and follow up. Who is it that, how many children are being pushed? Even this year, during COVID, I have followed up some students who just got a compartment in their board exam. Compartment in CBSE means you can take it again. That's what the board allows you. But the school principal told the child, you join the open school. She was pushed out. She was misled. When she did clear the open school and came back, she said, sorry, you won't be given admission. So I'm just saying that, all these things sound very nice, but you have to get down. You have to either even see beyond the lines. What is happening on the field, which schools are getting merged, which schools are getting closed, and how are children being pushed into vocational education. Please look at the vocational education courses. There is no education in that. These are only skills designed by the industry. So it comes under the skills qualification framework. Very poorly designed courses. It tells a student, why should any student be excited about it? It tells you, where you are. So it gives you another low status. So these things like online education or vocational education are being given are being pushed out, are being used for pushing out children. And the policy does not accept that there's anyone like a Dalit child or a Muslim girl or a tribal child. These words are not there to be seen in this policy. It puts them all under an umbrella called SEDG, a new acronym that has been devised. In its draft in 2009, it tried an acronym called URG, underrepresented groups or something like that. Here it's called SED, which means socio-economically disadvantaged groups. So very conveniently, everyone is pushed under that. When we do that in education, we know that a child who enters a school system comes very strongly with identity markers, and the school normally addresses, normally reproduces these inequities. That's what all our studies have shown. That's what Amartya Sen has written about. How does the education, the way it is designed today, actually reproduce inequalities? Those who come in with credentials, with sort of social advantage, and this is not just in India, this is in fact all over the world. Wherever education systems are unequal, wherever there's great inequity in the education system, and in our own country, we know that even the government system is stratified into 6, 7, 8 kinds of different government schools with different resources and different kinds of teachers selected into that. Delhi has one, has this model again of 6, 7 kinds, some heavily resourced. So this kind of an unequal system of education, not only does it give poor quality education to the poor and to the disadvantaged, but even the elite get poor quality education. And what happens is that the education system is used more like a stepping stone to try and get resources, whatever resources you can access. And so the competition at every stage, like the competition even at grade 6, to get admission into a Kendriya Vidyalaya or a Navodaya Vidyalaya or a Pratibha Vikas Vidyalaya. We don't understand why Delhi should have a Pratibha Vikas. Everyone's talent has to be developed, but you have to have certain marks and then you take an exam. So even admission is competitive and selective. So any competitive exam, and that's why we say the right to education says no board exam until you've done 8 years of good quality education, because a competitive exam assesses social advantage much more than the learning or the quality of learning of a learner. And so these are the kinds of issues which the policy is actually pushing. So we know already what is happening. We know already only 13% of our schools are compliant with the right to education. But now a policy which says that that is too restrictive. It allows detention. We know that the policy, when it came in, the RT, when it came in, the ministry had given a note, a beautiful note, saying that if a child fails, then we fail. We have not been able to provide that environment for a child to learn well. And detaining a child does not make a child a better learner the next year. So I'm saying that things that have happened are now being pushed aside, including the constitution in terms of what the states are being doing. There are 1 or 2 states which have said that they will set up, work towards their own policy. But on the whole, there is this complete diktat coming right from above and coming to the bureaucracy. It's coming, they're nodal officers within states who are supposed to be doing the implementation. So whether the academic SCRT, which is meant to be the nodal agency under the Right to Education Act, is not consulted, it comes to the officers. And also now online education for teacher education. This policy has no commitment for teacher education. More than 90%, almost 95% of our teacher education institutions are in the private sector already. And we know what happens to get a B.Ed. It's a very commercial sector, and there's very little quality in the teacher education, which is actually our biggest challenge. So despite that, there is no commitment that we find. And so now even states like Kerala or states which are well provisioned they're being told to modularize and make their teacher education customized as online courses through various other funding programs. This is a worry. I think I have taken more time, but I'll close here. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. No, you haven't taken more time, ma'am. It was a very, very profound and very on the telling coverage which told us about what is happening on the ground and about the perils of centralization and how the focus is on outcomes and how the system has become unequal and how we have to focus on what is more equitous for the students and so that the children get the justice they deserve. Thank you so much, ma'am. It was we are indeed honored to have heard you. And we'll definitely get more out of you in the question and answer session. So thank you now. I now have the honor of introducing our next speaker, Dr. Furqan Qamar. Professor Furqan Qamar is presently the Professor of Management at the Center for Management Studies, Jamia Millia, Islamia, New Delhi. He has served as the Secretary General of the Association of Indian Universities, the largest and one of the oldest network of universities in the world. In his illustrious career, Dr. Qamar has held the position of the Vice Chancellor of the University of Rajasthan and that of the Central University of Himachal Pradesh. He has also served as Advisor Education in the Planning Commission of India. Essentially a professor of management, he has keen research interest in public policy, planning, administration, and financing of higher education, and has numerous publications in journals of repute to his credit. In fact, I personally, in the last 15 days, I have read 3 articles of Professor Qamar in the Hindu, which is one newspaper I read. So he writes also often. Professor Qamar has chaired and has been the member of a large number of committees, working groups at the national and international level. And he brings with him academic eminence, leadership qualities, and exposure to best global practices. So indeed honored for you to have come here and speak here. Dr. Furqan Qamar will speak on flexible interpretation and selective implementation of national education policy in higher education. So I now request Professor Qamar to take over. Sir, please come in.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. As I was saying in the very beginning before the program started, that perhaps I said yes too early to your invitation, and that way I in fact deprived the audience from listening to Professor Krishna Kumar, who later on wanted to come, but then by the time I had already said yes. So my apologies to Professor Krishna Kumar ji, and thanks to him for also introducing me to this group. You said that you don't know from which perspective, from which sides we are coming. So let me clarify my position that I take the side of a person who is still trying to make sense of the national education policy as far as the higher education is concerned. And the more I try to understand, the more confused I become. And therefore, I conceptualized in one of my pieces that while we have been still struggling to make sense of the text of the national education policy, in the meantime, the national education policy has been used as a pretext to do whatever those in the decision-making positions wanted to do. And that is creating all the more confusion. I will essentially be focusing on higher education. And there are a few things about which we can say that the policy talks about in a very positive term. Madhu ji in his introduction has highlighted some of them. There are a few things about which we have issues. We are not able to make out that what do they actually want to and what is their intent of doing that. So say, for example, just to begin with, when they say, and I think no policy before had ever emphasized as much that there shall be no distinction between the public and the private higher education. They both shall be treated at par. Neither in funding nor in any other thing the private sector would be discriminated upon. So I think that makes us wonder that what do they actually want? They want the public system to become like a private system, or they want private system to become like a public system and perform accordingly. At some places you find mentioned that all private institutions would be behaving like a public spirited way. We don't know what does it actually mean. In a positive sense, the policy makes a commitment which was done way back in '68 that the nation should be committed to invest a minimum of 6% of GDP on higher education. This policy also mentions this. In what time frame? There are no indication. Whether we intend to achieve this with state partnerships, the center and state combined, or do we also want to include the private expenditure on education to meet the target? Such clarity is not there. And since in the past, many efforts were made to include private expenditure also as a part of the total expenditure on education to justify that we are nearing the goal of the 6% of the GDP. But if we presently look at the center and states expenditure on education by Ministry of Education, by other departments or other ministries within these states and in the center, the number is still about 2.9%. Some people cite a figure of about 3.7%, but I don't know from where they come from. The policy does talk about making an inclusive society, but as Anita ji was pointing out while speaking on school education, that this broad umbrella group of socio-economically deprived group, SEDG, which tries to cover everyone from gender to scheduled caste to scheduled tribes to minorities to otherwise deprived section of the society. So we don't know that by doing this, whether we will serve the purpose of promoting social justice and equity and equal and equitable opportunity of higher education to all or not. Of course, I initially thought, or I used to initially thought that that is more a matter of semantics than of substance. But then there are repeated instances that nothing in higher education happened after ancient India. So the only example that the policy quotes and cites is from the Nalanda times, Takshila times, Vikramshila times. And therefore it ignores all the known development in higher education. And despite all our limitations, I think the modern higher education, the way we understand it today, I think it had all begun in 18th century, and that is existing and that has grown and that has contributed significantly. Even in purely economic term, as an instrumentarian value of education, if India has become a $2.3 trillion economy, that has all been sustained by the people who have been educated through this system of education, not through the ancient system of education. Of course, the policy tries to balance this by also bringing in the sustainable development goal. So, but the impression that it gives is that the road to future goes via the past, via the ancient times. In very specific terms, the policy says that the present level of the participation in higher education that we normally refer to as gross enrollment ratio would be increased from the present about 27-28% to 50%. And there is a specific time frame given, 2035. I did some back of the envelope calculation. I find that this target would be achieved even if we do nothing by simply the normal compound average annual growth rate that the higher education has been growing with. And with the 4-year undergraduate programs, I think we would be easily achieving this goal. Maybe we might surpassing this goal. Most importantly, and I think to inculcate a sense of pride in all of us, the policy says that it aspires that by 2040, the higher education system, or rather the education system in India, would be second to none, meaning it will be the best system of higher education compared to the best of the world. And I have often been thinking that what does this mean, second to none? And I found that there could be 3 interpretations. One interpretation of this could be that we become the single largest system of higher education that no other country has. So India already has that distinction with almost 1,100 universities, 49,000 colleges, and standalone institutions. I mean, we are already the largest system found anywhere in the world. No other country, not even regional groupings, have this distinction. The second interpretation of this being second to none could be that, okay, in terms of enrollment, we provide higher education to as many people as no other country does. So we have already become second in that sense. We are only next to China. We used to be number 3 after United States and China, but now we have surpassed United States. So we are a little behind China. And if we achieve, and I'm sure that we will achieve this 50% GER in higher education, so we would very soon become second to none as far as the total number of people enrolled in higher education is concerned. Now there is a third dimension, and that third dimension is the dimension of quality. Will we be able to become the best known higher education system offering quality? I mean, there is a big question mark. As far as the present state of affairs are concerned, we are not reckoned amongst the best in any way. Of course, amongst the top 1,000 universities, some 40-45 of our institutions do fall in, but they are still way behind than the best of the world. Not only that, our best do not compare with the best of the world, but in fact, there is also this distinction that India has, and that's a dubious distinction, that the gap between the best of the institution and the rest of the institutions is so huge and is widening with such a speed that that should be worrying for the policy planners, for the implementations, etc. Even if you look at the NIRF ranking and you look at any of the parameters, 5-6 parameters that they use to rank institutions, say, for example, if you take the parameters of research, ISC Bangalore may be scoring about 92%, and which is ranked as the topmost institutions in the country. But the moment you come to 20th best university in the country, that scores drop down to 50%. In fact, the moment you reach it to the 100th best universities, 100 best higher educational institution out of 1,100, that score drops down to a bare minimum of only 2%. So that says the huge gap between the best of our country and the rest of our country. And these best the institutions of national importance, the central universities, and all those 40 which come amongst the top 1,000 of the world, you all take them together, they account for only about 2.5% of the total enrollment in higher education. So 98% of our people study in those rest of the higher educational institution, and we can imagine the kind of quality higher education that they should be getting. Does the policy provide for anything specific about doing something for improving the quality of those institutions which cater to 98% of the total enrollment? I think we feel disappointed. Of course, this policy talks about, or rather there is an explicit admissions that the quality is bad and the quality needs to be improved. And the whole quality agenda for higher education hinges around 3 or 4 dimensions. Initially, we thought that all of these 3 things are interrelated. And by the way, to many of these 3 dimensions, I personally thought that I agree with them, at least in terms of the principles and the concept, not necessarily the way they have been implemented. So they thought that we need to restructure the academic programs that higher educational institutions in the country offer. And when they spoke about restructuring, they mentioned about bringing in the liberal arts components, the kind of interdisciplinary and the multidisciplinary exposure to all students. So the kind of issues that you may be the best engineers, the toppers of the batch, but not a good human being. So they thought that, okay, the solution to that could come from educating them in a wide variety of mode of disciplines, and so that their development is holistic. So this was one kind of, or one set of argument that the policy gives about higher education. And I don't think anybody can disagree with them in principle. Then the other thing about the program restructuring, that talked about the mode in which these programs would be offered. And of course, in the mode, the way the technology integration and the edtech space has been created at the implementation stage has become somewhat disquieting. They were speaking about modularity and the flexibility and the multiple entry and multiple exits. I think they've been stretching it a bit too far. Yes, many of us did realize that our higher education system was too rigid and force these students to study a specific content which a specific teacher wanted to deliver under a specific circumstance and environment. And I think students needed to be given some freedom and some flexibility in that regard. We also said that students in higher education would be in a position to choose and decide and to make their own basket. So some beginning was made when this choice-based credit system was introduced. But now this policy opens us up and takes us to a different level, to a much different level. So like they are saying that, okay, up to 40% of the course content or maybe 50% of the course content could be taken from SWAM, from any other digital platforms, from within India, from another institutions other than where the students are enrolled. It goes on to mentioning something which we so far do not see anywhere in the world, that is that there would be depository kinds of accounts which every student would open and will go on depositing the credits that the students accumulate from anywhere, and then comes to an institution saying that, okay, I have accumulated these credits, evaluate them, and grant me a degree. I think I have become equivalent to an MBBS and give me an MBBS degree. So that is the idea. So that is, I think, is stretching it a bit too far. But in terms of modularity, flexibility, even multiple entry and multiple exit, I generally had agreed with those ideas. But I'll come a little later as to why I've become somewhat worried. Now, the whole idea was that this program restructuring would not be possible unless you also do some major restructuring in the institutions which are offering these programs. We are a kind of higher education system which is dominated by a very large number of small-sized institutions, monodisciplinary, single-disciplinary institutions, not only at the university level, that okay, the law universities and the teacher university and the child university kind of things, or forensic university, but even at the college level or general higher education college level, there are single arts college or single commerce college. The multidisciplinarity or many disciplines existing on the campus, offering people the choice to choose from, are very, very limited. And therefore, the policy argued that, okay, there's need for upsizing them, resizing them, so that many disciplines could be under one roof or could be in close proximity to a particular institution, so that a student could benefit from or could take advantage of these. But I think the next that they are suggesting that, okay, that would mean that about 49, 50,000 colleges, etc., may have to be either consolidated or may have to be clustered or may also have to be closed down to reduce the number to 15,000. So that raises exactly the kind of issues and challenges that Anita Rampal ji mentioned, that what would be its implication on the education of the poor, education of girls. We all know that any education, higher education, is much cheaper when it is provided closer to home than when the students have to travel long distances to avail the opportunity. The other thing in terms of the institutional restructuring, the policy talks about reclassifying all institutions into three categories. One is that there would be research-intensive university. That has been a long pending demand by many, who was saying that there are institutions who focus more on research, so the accreditation parameters also includes many other variables or many other dimensions which are not necessarily in sync with research. So the idea was that, okay, there would be these universities which will essentially be focused on research, not that they will not have teaching, they will have teaching, but their evaluation, assessment, accreditation, and ranking would be on the basis of their research output and their research performance. So the citation and the impact factor and the H-index and all those kinds of things. The second and the very large group of institutions, particularly most of the universities, they conceptualize to become a kind of teaching focused universities, where they would essentially focus their attention to teach and to produce graduates who are needed by the market. So I think the market orientation in the policy dominates the scene. So instrumentarian approach to higher education is very, very dominant. So produce graduates which are employable, produce graduates which are thought to be useful to industry. They are trained in technology that the industry is presently using, so that industry doesn't have to spend any money or time to further retrain them to become suitable for their purpose. So they should become job ready kind of an institution. So that was the idea, which was somewhat elaborated. And then if you read between the lines, that is the message that you get. So they teach, and their evaluation would be based on what happens to the graduate that come out of those campuses. How many of them progress further in their education, how many of them get jobs, etc. So their evaluation ranking criteria may be different. So maybe out of 1,100 universities, about 100 could become research universities. Another 1,000 could become teaching universities, and all other colleges, standalone institutions would become autonomous higher educational institution with power to grant degrees in their own name. So they would be disconnected from the university with which they were affiliated or were associated to. Now, on this issue, to be fair to the policy, right from Sadler Commission 1913 onwards, people have been raising issues that the affiliating system is not a good system. It in fact prevent good colleges from doing the necessary reforms in the curricula and take up some innovation and provide additional input. And on the other hand, they exert extra burden of affiliation, of conducting examination on the university, which distracts them from their core teaching and research activities. So every commission and committees did speak about separating the colleges from the university system, but none went so far as this policy had gone. Earlier, they thought that yes, it is desirable, but till we find a more appropriate method, we need not disturb the system. So gradually, we should try to reduce the number of colleges affiliated to universities. So we were largely successful. Earlier, many universities had more than 1,000 colleges affiliated to them. Gradually, it came that only 8 or 9 universities are left with more than 500 colleges. All others are now in the brackets of about 200 to 300. A bulk have less than 100. But now this policy says that all colleges should have freedom to award degrees in their own name. Sorry, there's some problem. So this reclassification into these 3 categories and how will this unfold is still not very clear, and so far no action has emerged. So we do not know that how will that be operationalized. The third thing is that this program restructuring and the institutional restructuring would not be possible unless you also restructure the regulatory framework. Personally, the more I thought about regulation and the more I worked on regulation, I found that the quality of higher education in India, at least, has been inversely proportional to the intensity of the regulation. And therefore, every evidence suggests to an enabling framework and minimizing the control regime, either in the form of centralization or at the state level regimentation. I think both the center and state would be as obnoxious a regulator for higher education. So none seems to be better than the other. But here the policy said that, okay, initial recommendation of the Kasturi Rangan committee was that 4 different agencies regulating higher education. But now in the final draft, it is one agency, Higher Education Commission of India, which will have the 4 verticals, one dealing with regulation, the other dealing with providing a framework for accreditation, whereby the monopoly of the NAC and the NBA could be broken and a large number of agencies could be licensed to accredit institutions. Then a separate vertical to take care of the funding of higher education. And the last vertical was the creation of a General Education Council. And the idea was that this General Education Council shall have representatives from the states, shall have experts, educationists, of course, people from industry as member, and then all other existing regulatory bodies to become professional and academic standard setting bodies. So like Bar Council would become a standard setting body for law education, and CTE would become a standard setting body for teacher education and the teacher's practice, and so on and so forth. And they will all be represented in the General Education Council, and the General Education Council would set the standards. So I was particularly happy that there is at least one mechanism which provides an opportunity of consultation before a decision is arrived at. But what we are seeing is that so far this regulatory reform, which should have been taken up first, and when they had taken this up first, they would have compulsorily be required to go to Parliament, because that needed repeal of some legislation, that needed creation of some legislation, and that could have triggered some debates with regard to the policy. But this has not happened so far. Now, technically speaking, I did not find anywhere that a policy has to be discussed in Parliament. They say that policy is a matter of the government and therefore the cabinet approval is sufficient. So technically they might be right. But in the past, at least the final draft of the policy, and prior to that, many other versions were generally discussed in the Central Advisory Board on Education. Now this new education policy, on the one side, we have a claim that, okay, that had the widest possible or largest possible extent of consultation, right from states, vice chancellors, education ministers, to Gram Panchayat level and to the village folks. And according to an estimates, as many as 6 lakhs inputs came, but there is no documentation and no curation available as to what those inputs were and to what extent those concerns were addressed. Of course, the draft policy, that is the Kasturi Rangan Committee reports, were placed in the Central Advisory Board on Education. And some states had expressed reservation. Tamil Nadu was one at the forefront. But once the final policy was done, so 500 page was in fact reduced to about 66 page document, and many things also changed substantially, which were not there in that draft. They were brought in. So that policy was never went to the Central Advisory Board on Education. So the only hope was that this regulatory reform would come first. And at that time, there would be a discussion, debate on the policy, its content, and maybe some moderation would take place. And after that, I think before any decisions are taken, that decisions would be through this General Education Council, which would be a representative body of the state's academics experts. And they would set standards, and in the process of setting a standard, they will also work out, or they will also at least provide input on the way and the processes that need to be adopted. That has not happened. So presently what is happening is that many announcements are made, and you saw them when 1 year of celebration of first anniversary of the National Education Policy was made in July 2021. We are only about 2 months away from the second anniversary, and you saw a number of announcements, and you were just wondering that where was these things in the National Education Policy. Let me say some of the quick the recent past initiative, like the Common University Entrance Test Examination. That was earlier named as Central University Entrance Test Examination. That was, so the abbreviation was in fact meant, read to be meant as the common university entrance examination was made compulsory for all central universities, but impression was given that as if it is the first step towards one nation, one examination, or one admission policy, as envisaged by the National Education Policy 2020. I wrote actually 3 pieces explaining that, in fact, the policy, to be fair to it, did say that, okay, we need to have a common principle for admission to higher education. But an NTA might conduct this test, and it would be the quality of the test and it would be the integrity of the NTA that would in fact entice institutions to adopt this test as a basis, as a method of selecting a student rather than each one conducting their own test and examinations. But it very explicitly mentioned that it will be left to individual universities and higher educational institutions to decide. So therefore, attributing this central university entrance test to the national education policy, I think is going far beyond the brief. And that makes us uncomfortable that what is the interpretation? What is the text? Are we sticking to text, or are we going to stick to the text, or we are just going to use it as a pretext to do whatever we want to? Similarly, of course, the national education policy did emphasize on technology integration. And at time, it gave impression that since we have shortage of quality teachers across country, and therefore we can take good teachers through technology to the remotest part of the world. But this idea of a digital university without any limit on the intake, and like what happened in school education, that pushing off people whom you think that they are not capable of attaining excellence to these digital mode, and then outsourcing some of the teaching to the edtech companies, allowing larger number of institutions to start online program, in fact, going to the extent of relaxing the accreditation norms to give provisional accreditation to colleges to enable them to offer online distance mode program. So all of these things are happening, many mentioned in the policy, many indicated in the policy, but not in detail, many not even indicated in the policy and are being indicated. So I think this text and the pretext kind of things should make us worry and keep us on our toes to see what happens to higher education. Thank you very much. I know that I have also taken longer time than assigned to me. Sorry, Madhuji.
Not at all, sir. In fact, we started a little late, so I think you were in time. Thank you very much, sir, for a very, very illuminating, thorough, and extensive coverage of the topic of interpretation and implementation of national education policy in higher education. There are so many areas which require attention, as been highlighted by you, about the problems of confusion, the problems of implementation. I think we will seek more from you as we go into the question and answer session. We have several questions, sir. Now, I will go through these questions, and I will request both you and Professor Madam Rampal to, we'll take these one by one. The first question is about the national education policy, talks about ethics and morals. Sadly, Indian society, even the contemporary society and its socio-religious ethos, is mostly obscurantist. Who will decide what morals and ethics are to be taught? This is one question. Ma'am, would you like to take this, or sir, would you?
I think Anita ji would be.
Yes.
Yes, I think the question itself indicates indicates the
Yeah.
worry and the skepticism about what this means. In fact, right through the policy, wherever it talks about Indian ethos, Indian knowledge systems, I didn't go into it, but that's extremely problematic because it's always the names and examples given are only Hindu Brahmins and those texts which are mentioned. So we don't even look at different kinds of literature or different kinds of contributions. More so now, this Indian knowledge system is becoming, as we know, what IIT Kharagpur has done in terms of its calendar. That itself is very problematic because it's not even true, the kinds of things that it has put out. So this chauvinism or this valorization of certain kinds of knowledges, not even questioning whether they are reliable, not appraising those knowledges, is going to happen. And yes, we've had a long debate in education about value education. We have a history of these debates, and it's very clear, even in the last 15, 20 years, that we talk of constitutional values, that it's not going to be. So we're not pushing in ethical, in fact, because it's not just ethical is more an individual's decision, but we are looking at values which are which impinge on living together, understanding, not othering people. And those are the constitutional values. So even in the NCF 2005, it was made very clear that we are right through whatever we teach. We have developed mathematics chapters in the primary level, science, environmental studies, which looks at justice, which looked at values, which looks, which understands even what eco-justice is. So this is obviously not taking that perspective, and it's going to use this to push, as we've seen what it's doing, even in terms of quite obscurantist or chauvinistic kind of ideas.
So there are two questions relating to centralization. One may relate to higher education. One is a general question. I'll read out both. Says, it is true that this centralization through the above policy, the NEP, defeats the purpose of federalism and the constitutional values. How do we ensure that every student gets a fair chance of accessing higher education like medical education through the NEET process, unless everyone has access to some same basic education? The second question is also related to the centralization issue. It says education being in the concurrent list. I think Madam had covered this part during her speech. Education being in the concurrent list is the shared responsibility of the union and the state governments. Should the states formulate education policies which are complementary to the national education policy? And should the national education policy not provide for decentralized mode of implementation, giving room for regional priorities? I think both ma'am and sir to take these questions.
Yes, in fact, last time the National Curriculum Framework, it is discussed in the Central Advisory Board where all states are present, and it's just a framework. It's not a curriculum. And states then make their curriculum, and the NCRT makes it for the CBSE, those schools which are affiliated to the central board. But every state is required to make its own curriculum, and there is no diktat as to what is essential and what. This policy, in fact, it almost in a demeaning way says states will add some local flavor, So even the role that has been given to the states is questionable. So Tamil Nadu has said, Kerala has said, we don't accept this. We will do what we think is right and important for our state, given our context. And I think more states should be taking it seriously in terms of their own socio-cultural context.
So
I would like to say, when I read that Tamil Nadu has announced a committee to frame its own education policy, so my first reaction was that it would probably be sad if every state starts announcing its own policy. But then I reflected, and then I realized that the reason for states to take this route is because there has not been enough scope for consultation and taking them on board and making them as an equal partner. And then I realized that there have been some people who have been saying that is it a national policy or is it only a government of India policy? And I think that questions need to be answered very clearly. There is no doubt that under the existing framework of the Constitution, higher education and education as a whole is in the concurrent list, is a shared and the joint responsibility. They both can legislate on matter education. In case of higher education, center sometimes takes advantage that there is one clause which says that coordination and maintenance of standards would be solely in the domain of the center. But I think that applies only to higher education, and the policy deals with a lot many more issues than only the standards and coordination and the maintenance of standards. So I think essentially it should be the consultation process and a consensus building process and taking people on board. Second, then I realized that, one national policy for all states in the country is small, big, with huge variations in size, differences in languages, etc. Perhaps would not work. In the past also, we have created enough scope that, this national level policy would percolate down and implemented through further state level policies, and even to the extent that in school education, the block level you can go to have a policy for the speedy and effective implementation of the policy. So the first point that I'll say is that I think the consultation is the key to take people into confidence so that they come on the broad principle. Second thing is that we need not be and we must not be very prescriptive about anything. So like Anita ji said, that you provide a broad framework and within the framework allow states to exercise their discretions and their needs to fill in the details. I would agree to that specific points that the basis of admission to higher education. I mean, in one of the pieces that I wrote, I said that, if we aspire to become one of the best universities in the world, so those universities and those countries where these universities are located, they do not prescribe a one single entrance test as the sole basis for admission. They do have a more multidimensional, holistic approach to selecting their students. Sometimes, of course, you can argue that their admission process would also be subjective, favoring to certain sections in class. So, for example, even in Harvard, the legacy admissions could be challengeable dimensions from our point of view. But one thing is very clear that any test-based admission, which is based on the NCERT and CBSE curricula alone, is a huge disadvantage to people coming from out of other remaining 37 boards. So I did make some quick analysis of the NEET examination, which was made compulsory. Prior to that, in fact, Tamil Nadu was admitting a student on the basis of the board exam performances. Delhi University was doing so in all programs. But then the NEET was made compulsory. And the result is that in 2021 NEET examination, while 77% of the people who came from CBSE board qualified the test, those coming from Tamil Nadu, Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, they were averaging at about 45% or 43% or so. So people use these data to say that their education system is bad, not good enough. That amounts to saying that perhaps there should only be CBSE as a single board for the whole nation and all schools be affiliated to them. But then that is not the idea under the constitutional framework. And since the whole test is based on a particular set of syllabus, therefore those people are losing out whose curricula doesn't match. So yes, you are right. So that serves to the benefit of some and to a huge disadvantage of the other. A very recent piece, in fact, I wrote, and the sum of that was that, like when the CUET was announced, the UGC chairperson was very explicitly saying that it will not promote poaching. While NEET experiment and the IIT JEE experiment tells us that the poaching gets a very, very upper hand, making some schools even becoming a dummy school. But within 7 days of his statement, the coaching institute started preparing themselves. Some edtech companies started establishing more offices and branches and campus. They started projecting the number of people. So that article came in National Herald, and the sum and substance was that markets tend to defy the expectation of those people who pride in predicting what will happen. So the coaching is another barrier which costs money, and I think those costs have also come known. So again, it works to the disadvantage of the deprived and the poor and the others. So best way could have been some kind of a normalization score, or working with the school boards to standardize their examination, evaluation system, etc., to reduce the variations in marks, etc. I mean, and there is also last thing. I mean, if in Delhi University 100% was not enough to get admission to the college and course of your first choice, you needed a few percentage more than 100. That also comments on the gap that we have, that I initially pointed out, between the best and the rest. So right from Meghalaya, Manipur to Delhi, if all students are coming to Delhi University, that comments badly about all those other institutions that are in that 2,500, 2,700 kilometers, and how can we improve quality of those institutions, and therefore reduce pressure on only a few. So I think I have answered this to the best of my ability.
Yes. There are two questions. Of course, this was also addressed during the thing. These are related to the issue of the rights-based framework. One is that under the Right to Education Act of 2009 has been acclaimed as a landmark law and a historic moment, making free elementary education for every child legally enforceable, among other things. How far does the National Education Policy of 2020 complement or supplement the Right to Education Act? The related question is how far the rights-based approach on education has worked on the ground. Ma'am?
I have addressed this.
Yes.
The policy completely opposes it. In fact, tries to, override it by every clause that it introduces. And as I said, even trying to say that the open school can function. And the problem with the open school is not just the low cost fee that I had mentioned, but also the religious organizations. Many of the right-wing organizations which run Ekal Vidyalayas are all affiliated. I mean, about a lakh of such schools are affiliated to open schools. So that's the way of circumventing certain basic requirements and certain affiliation norms. And the policy clearly does that, opposes it. And we know that the RT, because of the commitment, because of the lack of commitment to actually enforce it, in terms of getting enough teachers, in terms of getting, children getting a good learning environment, that's important. And teachers are the crucial element, is the teacher and the assessment, the continuous assessment that you have to make to see that children are in fact supported and they're learning. If either of these is weak, this is what happens. The system just is collapsing, and then you put the blame on the teacher or the child, and you want to fail them, which is the expected story. So I just want to say that even earlier when Furqan was saying that sometimes you can't predict what's happened, you can predict. We know that a large competitive exam is based on a shadow industry. There is nothing that we have to wait to see, you know. We know that the open distance learning courses in the university is based on the kunjis and the coaching. Whether it's NEET, whether it's JE, we know what happens in the quota industry. And that's why Tamil Nadu had said that this expects that children are propped up with all these coachings and all these devices and all this supporting, and those who can't afford it will be thrown out. So I'm saying that it's not a matter of predicting, we know that.
But we don't want to. We don't want to know. We in fact pretend not to know.
Obviously, because our rhetoric is saying something completely different.
There's a question on the nomenclature of the Ministry of Human Resource and Development. It says, under the National Education Policy 2020, the name of the Ministry of Human Resource and Development has been changed to the Ministry of Education. Does the revised nomenclature signify a progressive change? Not a substantial question, but you may like to respond, sir and ma'am.
Anita ji,
I would just say that, yes, in fact, human resource comes more from the human capital theories, and which is not really what the humanist theories that our policies have always held. You know, it doesn't. So when they had changed the name, there was a lot of concern of why it's changed from education. Now, by saying back to education doesn't help us very much, because the policy is completely in terms of human capital neoliberal framework. And so it's just notional that it's changed. Its humanist paradigm has not come with it.
I would agree. You see, over the past 70 years, we have changed the name at least 3 times. Ministry of Education, Sports and Culture. Then Ministry of Education and Culture. Sports became a separate ministry. Then the idea, even going beyond this human resource development to nut bolt issues, the idea was that all departments dealing with development of people, education and their training, so they should all come together. So idea was that sports, culture, even part of the labor for apprenticeship, etc., would also come there. But I think over time, what we saw was that culture was separated, sports was separated, even a separate ministry for skill development came in. So we created many classification categories. So it doesn't matter whether it's Ministry of Education or by whatever name it's known. Easier to pronounce.
So there's one question on the dual degree academic program. The UGC has given legal sanctity to the dual degree academic program, enabling students to simultaneously pursue 2 academic programs at multiple levels. What are the problems that are likely to emanate from offering simultaneous degree courses in the regular offline mode?
I mean, can I, Anita ji? Actually, this nomenclature of the dual in this context is a problem. And that problem has been existing for quite some time. The first time this issue was discussed was in 2012-13, and I was in fact the chair of that committee. And the essential issue was that should a student be allowed to pursue 2 degrees simultaneously or more than 1 qualification simultaneously. The arguments were both stacked in favor and against. Against the arguments at that time were that, okay, there is a minimum workload, minimum expectation of the students to devote to get a degree. And therefore, by allowing them to pursue another degree simultaneously, concurrently, would amount to their diluting the quality and would lead to many other unethical and unfair practices in examination to qualify both the degrees. On the other hand, there were arguments that, I mean, maybe not as much in professional and technical education, but general higher education, students have a lot of free time at their disposal. And presently, there are many ways in which a student could learn. And therefore, if they want to better their career prospect, they should be permitted. So at that time, we had recommended that allowing them to pursue 2 degrees simultaneously in a regular full-time mode may not be advisable, because there are a number of logistics issues, attendance-related issues, monitoring the issues. One of the things was that we presently control admissions through this migration certificates, which is supposed to be submitted in original. And that is a kind of control that to ensure that the student doesn't take admission anywhere else. So how do you manage this to see that a student does only another degree? But what that committee had recommended was that, okay, one full-time degree if you are doing, simultaneously you could do another qualification, diploma, certificates, advanced diploma kind of programs, which usually universities run in the afternoon or the evening mode to better your career prospects. Also, you could have another degree program, but through this distance open correspondence mode. In any case, many students do take admission in the Institute of Correspondence course or IGNOU simultaneously while they are doing courses in some universities. After that, there was another committee headed by the then vice chairman of the UGC, Bhushan Patwardhan. That committee also said that no full-time 2 degrees simultaneously. But now it has come that they could also do 2 degrees simultaneously as a full-time regular mode. I think it will have its implications in terms of logistics. Other than logistics, it also has the potential that the students who secure higher score in the test on the basis of which they are admitted, they would block 2 seats in different courses. And that will leave lesser number of seats for a little less so-called meritorious in terms of the test scores. So I think it will further create a scarcity of good opportunities for relatively less performing students as far as these tests are concerned. Perhaps UGC did not apply its mind fully, and as things proceed, it will happen. But as regards one offline and one online or another certificate diploma along with a degree program, I think if it helps students in their career planning, let it be. So, but nomenclature of the dual is a problematic here. Simultaneous or concurrent 2 degrees is a good nomenclature.
Thank you. So we'll take the last 3 questions. So first is the question on the medium of instruction. I'm clubbing 2 questions and 2 longish questions. One is about the medium of instruction and at the school level, one is at the higher education level. NEP advocates wherever possible the medium of instruction until at least grade 5, be preferably till grade 8 and beyond, will be the home language, mother tongue, local language, regional language for both public and private schools. At the same time, many state government governments such as AP, Telangana have introduced English medium in government schools, indicating immense demand for English medium schools. In this context, what would be a good policy on the medium of education at primary level? How good are teaching resource material in various Indian languages? How do we inform the parents in society that mother tongue is the best medium for instruction and that learning in English medium does not necessarily give good learning outcomes both in English and other subjects? Finally, how realistic is it to implement this policy? This is about the schools. The next one related point is lately the issue of language is resurfaced with the suggestion that Hindi ought to replace English as the link language for the non-Hindi speaking peoples of India. With the world converging into a global village with English as an almost universal medium of higher education and a skill much in demand in the service industry, what is the most appropriate formulation for the medium of instruction at the higher secondary and higher education levels in India? Ma'am, you and then sir.
I think, yeah, I'll start with the fact that we have never really had a language policy, and that's a major lacuna. We only had a language formula, 3-language formula, which came in, as we know, which came in when the states were reconstituted on a linguistic basis. And also we know that the problems associated with that, what should be the 3-language formula said that the southern states the northern states, which are Hindi speaking states, should preferably take the second language as one of the southern languages. No northern state has ever implemented the 3-language formula. And it was only the southern states, leaving Tamil Nadu, which rightly, for its own self-respect movement, its own struggles and people's demands, it did not, and the fact that this very Sanskritized kind of Hindi was being imposed as a second language. So Tamil Nadu decided it didn't want to implement it. But I'm saying that's the major lacuna even today. People take decisions only on either a populist kind of an understanding or a political imperative, because no one understands, and our school system doesn't really teach language the way it should be taught. Our pedagogy of language is not there. We teach a subject. So we teach Hindi as a subject and we teach English as a subject, which is not how languages should be taught. We should start from the first language. We know that the development of a person's relationships with the world and a person's brain, everything depends on the first language. And the reading and writing of the first language happens differently in a person than the reading and writing of a second language. And if the first language is given time and a child is given time to really be proficient in that, and it's taught in a way that is conversational and it's related with how, because many of our languages, as I said, are classicized forms of language. And even Kerala, for instance, had to change its Malayalam because it did not really address the Malayalam which is spoken by everyone. Even within a state, there can be differences in terms of the social status also, of which area and which way a certain language is spoken. So yes, if we teach the first language and we have the teaching, reading and writing in the first language, that the second language is learned much better. Every research tells us that. So whether it's a second language, which is a regional language, so from an indigenous tribal language, if the second language is the regional language and the third language is English, if it's taught how the pedagogy should happen, it's really the best thing to do. We don't do that, and the switching suddenly to English medium, in fact, is the worst thing to happen for children, because they get then completely marginalized. Even the first language, if it's taught the way that very often our Hindi textbooks or our Malayalam textbooks or our Gujarati textbooks do, even they alienate children, and because of the way that the language is used. So this is a major issue for inclusion and for participation. And a country like Papua New Guinea, we always read about it as a model of what it's done and how it's included and ensured participation of children. I was lucky to meet the education minister when she visited here and had a long discussion with her. At that time, which was many years back, Papua New Guinea has a population much smaller, I forget the exact number now, much smaller than Delhi. And at that time, they had 400 languages, textbooks in 400 languages in their primary schools. So that is important to understand. When we say the language problem, it is our problem, the system problem, not the child's problem. So, and they had developed languages based on the orthographies of spoken languages which had never used a script, because we know that a language doesn't have a script, it borrows a script. Like Hindi borrows Devanagari. Marathi also borrows Devanagari, but then includes certain symbols for sounds which may not be available. They developed orthographies, and they decided, sitting with small communities, and they decided what kind of a script to use. And the education minister rightly told me that, India is much better resource than our country. And how is it that India thinks it's a problem? Today, we produce textbooks on the basis of computers, and we just have the same format, and we, make it in another language. So I'm saying that this is something that we have not taken pedagogically, we've not taken in terms of a child's right, and always even the right to education, which said in the first language, mother tongue. By the time it came through various ministries and came back to the education ministry, there were 4 words added, as far as possible, which meant that you don't need to do it. That is a tragedy.
Sir?
I think she has answered more comprehensively than I can answer. The only thing is that I can't help but recall that the policy says, and I think the educationist needs to examine that, it says that children learn many languages quickly and in a far more efficient manner. To what extent it's true or not true, I think educationists need to apply.
Yes, that's a misleading statement, because children learn to speak if they are immersed in a certain environment. You know, they're playing with children, they're in an environment where it's being spoken, but they don't learn reading and writing of so many languages by grade 3, which the policy says that by grade 3 they should know these 3 languages. It's the wrongest thing to be doing.
Also, there are many assumptions in the policy that also needs to be looked at. And had it been discussed, really, perhaps these things could have been pointed out, and perhaps there was one question which somebody had posted about permitting foreign universities to offer courses and degrees here.
Yes.
I think throughout the policy, and even before policy in many other documents, there are, confusion abound about export of education and import of education. So they start the whole argument by saying that so many Indians go abroad and so many billions of foreign exchange are committed. So we need to, rather than that, bring in more students to India, and you have study in India policy, and prior to that, some 30 years ago, the promotion of Indian higher education abroad, etc., etc. None of them succeeded in increasing the numbers. So export remains stagnant of higher education. But in the same breath, they bring in the idea of the import of higher education. So bringing in foreign universities to provide education is not about exporting higher education, is speaking in money terms. Ministry of Commerce identified 18 champion sector for promotion of the services export. Education is one of them. So they want to promote export, but they end up promoting import of higher education. So when these institutions come, it amounts to importing higher education. Will that lead to import substitution? Meaning those who are going to US, Europe, many other countries would stop going there and would start studying in these universities? My understanding is no, it will not happen. People go abroad for many reasons, educational, non-educational, all put together. I have collected some data and found that studying in India is much more expensive than going abroad, at least in those institutions which are high fee charging institutions in India, because here the student has to either take loan or spend parents' savings to pay the whole amount of fees. If you go abroad, usually the students take care of about the first 2 semesters of the fees and starts financing her own education, either by working on campus, off campus, scholarships, and so on and so forth. Now, in the process or in a hurry to invite them, earlier things were that, okay, the top 100 would come to India, then top 100 became top 500. Now it has become top 1,000 universities by THE, or so we are reducing standards. But I don't think the bests are very keen to come in, and we will end up perhaps inviting the middle level or sometimes even lower level kind of institutions coming to India and offering these programs. Will they bring in foreign direct investments? I doubt. In India, there is one model which is tried and tested in commerce, that they always sign a joint venture. So there is an Indian company, Indian partner who does all investments, and they bring in a kind of softwares and soft supports. Not even teachers would come from there on full-time basis. So these are the challenges.
In
Thank
fact,
you, sir.
yes,
Yeah, ma'am. Yeah.
other countries have seen, I mean, Singapore also, that the top level universities never bring in their best. So, it's just the brand, that's all. But it's not as the teaching or other things and other, as also pointed out.
Thank you, ma'am. There are a couple of questions which have already been answered under the centralization, decentralization issue. Those are about universities holding their own exams and about the NEET. So we've already, thanks to the participation and the enthusiastic questions which were posted here, we've covered the entire gamut. I think I want to now thank both the professors here, Professor Anita Rampal and Professor Furqan Qamar. Thank you so much for being here and covering the entire gamut of national education policy and giving us an illuminating address, and also uh, fielding all the questions with so much of patience and clarity. And I'm sure all the participants who are here would be thanking you too. On behalf of Anekdhara, I would like to thank both the professors and the participants and our own team. Uh, Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am, once again. With this, we'd like to
Thank you.
go offline. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.